Wealthy businessman coldly rejects a lovely widow seeking help, but when he learns who her husband was, he immediately regrets doing so. James Carter sat behind his massive oak desk, the polished wood gleaming under the soft glow of his office lights. The room was a testament to his success. Expensive artwork adorned the walls, and the view from the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the bustling city below. He was a man of stature, known for his sharp business acumen and even sharper disregard for those who failed to meet his standards. This morning, however, something unusual interrupted the smooth flow of his day. Maria Jenkins stood at the threshold of his office, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the worn strap of her handbag. She was small and fragile in comparison to the imposing figure of James, her face lined with the stress of sleepless nights and endless worry. Her clothes, though clean, were modest and hinted at the hardships she'd endured since her husband's untimely death. Maria's voice wavered as she explained her situation, each word a struggle against the rising tide of desperation that threatened to overwhelm her. Her eyes, though weary, held a flicker of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this powerful man might extend a hand to help her out of the darkness. James barely looked up from the stack of papers in front of him, his pen moving with mechanical precision as he scribbled notes on a contract. When Maria finished speaking, he raised his eyes and offered her nothing more than a dismissive glance. "Mrs. Jenkins," he began, his voice cold and devoid of empathy, "I'm afraid I don't have the luxury of giving handouts to everyone who walks through my door. My business is not a charity, and I have no interest in funding what I assume is another hopeless cause." His words cut through the air like a knife, each one landing with the weight of a final judgment. Maria felt her heart sink, the last shred of hope she'd held on to crumbling into dust. She had known it was a long shot, coming here, but the reality of his rejection hit harder than she'd anticipated. Still, she managed to keep her composure, nodding slightly as she forced herself to accept his decision. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Carter," she whispered, her voice barely audible. With that, she turned and left the room, her footsteps echoing down the long corridor as she walked away from the last thread of hope she'd clung to. James watched her go, her frail form disappearing into the distance without a second thought. He shrugged, returning to his work with the efficiency of a man who believed his time was far too valuable to waste on the likes of her. In his mind, Maria was just another person trying to take advantage of his success, a parasite looking for a handout. The details of her life were irrelevant to him. All that mattered was the bottom line, and she didn't factor into it. As Maria stepped out of the gleaming office building and into the harsh light of day, her thoughts raced. The cold breeze that whipped through the streets seemed to mirror the chill that had settled in her heart. Yet even in her despair, there was a spark of determination. She had her children to think of, two innocent souls who depended on her for everything. She couldn't afford to break down now, not when they needed her to be strong. The tears she'd held back in James's office threatened to spill over, but she bit them back, focusing instead on what she would do next. James, on the other hand, had already forgotten about the encounter. He didn't know that the man who had saved his life so many years ago was the same man whose widow had just walked out of his office. The memory of that day, buried deep under layers of time and ambition, remained locked away in the recesses of his mind. He had long since distanced himself from the past, from the experiences that had shaped him into the man he was today. But the past has a way of resurfacing, and James Carter was about to learn that some debts cannot be easily dismissed, no matter how much time has passed. The evening sky was a deep indigo as James Carter sat alone in his grand living room, the silence broken only by the soft clink of ice against crystal as he swirled his glass of whiskey. The room was a testament to his wealth. Luxurious furniture upholstered in rich fabrics, a Persian rug that stretched across the floor, and a marble fireplace that crackled with a low, comforting fire. Yet despite the opulence surrounding him, James felt a vague sense of unease, a restlessness that the alcohol couldn't quite quell. He was a man used to control, but tonight, something gnawed at the edges of his mind, refusing to be drowned by the amber liquid in his glass. Just as he began to settle into his thoughts, the doorbell rang, its sharp chime slicing through the quiet. James set down his glass and made his way to the door, his curiosity piqued by the unexpected visit. Standing on the threshold was Colonel Richard Thompson, a man James hadn't seen in years, but recognized immediately. The colonel's face, weathered by time and experience, lit up with a warm smile as he greeted James with a firm handshake. "James, it's been too long," the colonel said, his voice carrying the gruffness of a man who had seen more than his share of battle. James welcomed his old friend inside, and soon the two were seated by the fire, their conversation flowing easily as they caught up on lost time. They spoke of old comrades, of the years they'd spent in the service, and of the battles that had shaped them into the men they were today. As the evening wore on, their conversation turned to the past, to the men who had served under them. It was then that Colonel Thompson mentioned John Jenkins, a name that made James pause mid-sip, his attention sharpening instantly. "John Jenkins," the colonel began, his tone somber, "was one of the bravest men I ever had the honor of serving with. You remember him, don't you, James? He was the one who saved your life during that ambush, pushed you out of the line of fire without a second thought for his own safety. Damn shame what happened to him." The colonel shook his head, a shadow passing over his features. "He died a few months ago, left behind a wife and 2 kids. They're struggling now from what I hear. Maria, his widow, can't seem to catch a break." The name Maria hit James like a punch to the gut. The room seemed to close in around him as the realization dawned. Maria Jenkins, the woman he had coldly dismissed earlier that day, was the widow of John Jenkins, the very man who had saved his life. The air in the room suddenly felt too thick, the warmth from the fire oppressive as the weight of his actions settled over him like a heavy shroud. James's hand tightened around his glass, his knuckles whitening as a deep, unshakable guilt began to take root in his chest. He set the glass down, the sound of it hitting the table barely registering as the colonel's words echoed in his mind. How could he have been so blind, so heartless? The image of Maria standing in his office, her voice trembling as she pleaded for help, replayed in his mind with painful clarity. He had dismissed her without a second thought, not knowing or caring who she was or the sacrifices her husband had made. The guilt twisted in his stomach, making him feel sick as he realized the depth of his mistake. Colonel Thompson, oblivious to the turmoil brewing inside James, continued talking, but his words faded into the background as James grappled with his emotions. The shame was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the pride he'd always taken in his success. For the first time in years, he felt small, insignificant. Like all his wealth and power meant nothing in the face of the debt he owed to John Jenkins. And yet, when given the chance to repay even a fraction of that debt, he had turned his back on the man's family. The fire crackled softly as the room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the colonel sensing the change in James's demeanor. But James was too lost in his own thoughts to notice. All he could think of was the look in Maria's eyes as she left his office, the quiet despair, the dignity she tried so hard to maintain despite the crushing weight of her circumstances. The realization that he had contributed to her suffering gnawed at him, and for the first time in his life, James Carter felt the cold sting of regret. The next morning, James awoke with a sense of urgency that he hadn't felt in years. The weight of his guilt hung over him like a storm cloud, pressing him into action. He dressed quickly, choosing a simple outfit, an unusual departure from his usual tailored suits, and made his way to the garage. The drive to Maria's house felt longer than it was, each mile amplifying the nervous tension coiled in his chest. He had never ventured into this part of town before. The worn streets and faded houses, a stark contrast to the polished world he was accustomed to. As he pulled up in front of Maria's small, dilapidated home, the reality of her situation hit him with full force. The house was in dire need of repair, its paint peeling and windows cracked. The lawn, though tidy, was sparse and dry, except for a small patch of garden where Maria was bent over, working diligently in the morning sun. She wore a simple dress, her hands dirty from tending to the vegetables she was carefully nurturing. It was clear she was doing everything in her power to provide for her children, despite the overwhelming odds stacked against her. Maria looked up as she heard the car door slam, her brow furrowing in confusion when she saw James approaching. She wiped her hands on a rag and stood, her expression guarded as he came closer. "Mr. Carter?" she asked, her voice laced with surprise and a hint of wariness. She hadn't expected to see him again, let alone on her doorstep. The memory of their last encounter was still fresh in her mind, and she couldn't help but wonder what had brought him here now. "Mrs. Jenkins," James began, his voice softer than she remembered, "I came to apologize for how I treated you yesterday. I didn't know who your husband was." He hesitated, the words he had rehearsed on the drive over suddenly feeling inadequate. "John saved my life years ago, and I owe him a debt that I can never repay. I should have helped you when you came to me, and I'm deeply sorry for turning you away." Maria listened in silence, her face remaining calm and composed. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine remorse that colored his words. When he finally finished, she nodded slowly, acknowledging his apology. "I appreciate that you came all this way to tell me this," she said, her voice steady. She motioned for him to follow her inside, and they walked together to the front door. The interior of the house was as modest as the exterior, small, clean, but undeniably worn by years of struggle. The furniture was old, the walls in need of fresh paint, and the kitchen nearly bare, save for a few essentials. They sat at the small kitchen table, where James placed a check in front of her, a substantial sum that could easily alleviate her financial burdens. "Please," he said, his tone earnest, "take this. It's the least I can do after everything John did for me. You and your children deserve better than this." Maria stared at the check for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. She could feel the weight of what this money represented, the potential ease it could bring to her life. But then she shook her head, sliding the check back across the table. "Thank you, Mr. Carter, but I can't accept this," she said, her voice firm but kind. "John wouldn't want us to rely on someone else to make it through. He always believed in hard work and self-reliance, and I've learned to carry on with that same spirit." James looked at her, stunned by her refusal. "But Maria," he protested, "this money could help you rebuild, give your children the life they deserve. You don't have to do this alone." Maria smiled, a small, sad smile that spoke of both loss and newfound strength. "I'm not alone," she said quietly. "I have my children, my memories of John, and the support of this community. We're managing, bit by bit. I've found purpose in working hard, in showing my children that even in difficult times, we can stand on our own 2 feet. That's how I want to honor John's memory, not by accepting charity, but by living the values he held dear." James fell silent, humbled by her words. He had come here expecting to make amends with money, to ease his guilt with a gesture of wealth. But Maria had shown him something far more valuable: pride, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to the principles her husband had lived by. He realized that no amount of money could ever replace the strength and dignity she had found within herself. As James drove away from Maria's home, a storm of emotions churned within him. He had come expecting to leave lighter, his guilt eased by a simple transaction. But the weight of her refusal hung heavily on him, more unsettling than the burden he had carried before. Maria's quiet strength and firm rejection of his offer left him with a feeling he couldn't quite place, a mixture of confusion, respect, and something deeper that gnawed at his conscience. How could someone in her position turn down the very thing he had always valued above all else? In the days that followed, James found it impossible to shake thoughts of Maria. His mind, once consumed by contracts, deals, and the pursuit of wealth, now wandered to that small, worn house and the determined woman who lived there. Even in his sleek, modern office, surrounded by the trappings of his success, he felt a growing sense of disquiet. The satisfaction he once derived from his work seemed hollow, every accomplishment overshadowed by the memory of Maria's refusal. The realization that his wealth meant nothing in the face of her dignity and resilience began to unsettle him deeply. Driven by an inexplicable need to understand, James started to discreetly observe Maria's life from a distance. He found himself returning to her neighborhood, parking his car a block away and watching from afar. What he saw in those brief glimpses both surprised and humbled him. Maria's life was far from easy, but she was not alone. The community around her, though modest and struggling in its own right, came together in ways James had never witnessed before. Neighbors dropped off bags of groceries when they could, offered to fix broken items around her home, and even watched over her children so she could work in peace. These small acts of kindness moved James in ways he didn't expect. He watched as Maria greeted each gesture with grace and gratitude, her strength bolstered by the support of those around her. These were people who had little themselves, yet they gave freely, without expectation of anything in return. It was a stark contrast to the world James knew, where every interaction was transactional, every relationship based on what could be gained. The generosity and solidarity he witnessed were foreign concepts to him, but they sparked something within him, an awakening to a life he had never considered. As he observed the simple yet profound exchanges between Maria and her neighbors, James felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping into his chest. It wasn't guilt or shame, but a deep, aching sense of loss, an understanding that despite all his wealth, he had been missing something vital in his life. The laughter of children playing in the yard, the warmth of a shared meal, the comfort of knowing others cared. These were things money couldn't buy, yet they seemed to hold a value far greater than any fortune he had amassed. Back in his office, the sterile environment felt suffocating. The once prized artifacts of his success, the gleaming awards, the framed contracts on the wall, seemed meaningless, empty symbols of a life lived in isolation. His thoughts were no longer dominated by strategies for increasing profits or expanding his empire. Instead, they were filled with images of Maria's life, of the connections and bonds that made her world rich in ways his could never be. For the first time, James began to question the choices he had made, the path he had followed so relentlessly. The more he thought about it, the more James realized that the wealth he had worked so hard to accumulate had built walls around him, isolating him from the very things that gave life meaning. He had always prided himself on his independence, his ability to succeed without anyone's help. But now he saw that independence for what it truly was: loneliness. Maria, in her humility and strength, had shown him a different way of living, one where success wasn't measured in dollars, but in the richness of human connection and community. James found himself longing for something he had never even realized he was missing. The desire to be part of something greater than himself, to contribute to a world where people cared for one another, began to grow within him. He didn't know how to bridge the gap between his life and the one Maria and her neighbors lived, but he knew he couldn't go back to the way things were. Something inside him had changed, and there was no ignoring it. The veil had been lifted, and he was finally seeing the world in a way he had never allowed himself to before. James found himself spending more time in Maria's neighborhood, no longer just an observer, but someone who wanted to be involved, to make a difference. The change within him had been gradual, but now it was undeniable. He had watched Maria become a beacon of hope for others, her quiet strength and determination influencing not just her children, but the entire community. She had begun volunteering at the local community center, a modest but vital place where people came together to support one another. Despite her own struggles, Maria was there every day, helping other families navigate the challenges she knew all too well. Seeing this, James felt a stirring within him, a realization that the life he had led was shallow, devoid of the deeper connections that brought real fulfillment. The way Maria had become a symbol of resilience and hope made him question everything he had once valued. Her children, too, were thriving, despite the odds stacked against them. They excelled in school, their faces always lit with the kind of joy and innocence that belied the hardships they endured. It was clear that they were being raised with love, strength, and a deep sense of community, values that James had long since lost sight of in his pursuit of success. The more he witnessed Maria's impact on those around her, the more James felt compelled to do something meaningful. The thought of merely writing a check and walking away, as he had always done, now seemed empty, insufficient. This time, his desire to help wasn't driven by guilt or a need to absolve himself of past mistakes. It was born from a genuine admiration for Maria and a growing respect for the community she had become an integral part of. He realized that he didn't just want to contribute financially. He wanted to be involved, to use his resources and skills to make a tangible difference. James decided to start with the community center, recognizing it as the heart of the neighborhood. He arranged a meeting with the center's director, a no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Wallace, who had dedicated her life to serving the people of the area. When he arrived at the center, it was bustling with activity, children laughing, volunteers sorting donations, and people sharing stories and advice over cups of coffee. It was a far cry from the sterile, impersonal environment of his office, and James felt a sense of warmth and belonging that was entirely new to him. Mrs. Wallace greeted him with a mix of curiosity and caution. She had heard of James Carter, the wealthy businessman with a reputation for ruthlessness, and was wary of his sudden interest in the center. James, sensing her skepticism, spoke earnestly. "I want to help," he said, looking her in the eye. "Not just with money, though. I'm willing to fund whatever you need. I want to be a part of what you're doing here, to offer my time and any expertise I can share. I've spent too long focused on the wrong things, and I'd like to start giving back." Mrs. Wallace studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. She had seen many people come and go, some with good intentions, others with none. But there was something in James's tone, a sincerity she hadn't expected, that made her reconsider. "If you want to help, Mr. Carter, it won't be easy," she said finally. "We're a close-knit community here, and trust is earned, not given. You'll need to get your hands dirty, work alongside us, and understand what we're really about. If you're serious, I'll give you a chance." James nodded, his resolve solidifying. "I'm serious, Mrs. Wallace. I'm ready to do whatever it takes." He meant it. The work he had once taken pride in seemed distant and irrelevant now. Here, in this modest community center, he found a sense of purpose he had never known. The prospect of working directly with the people, of contributing to something that truly mattered, filled him with a newfound energy and determination. Over the following weeks, James immersed himself in the life of the community center. He attended planning meetings, helped organize events, and began using his business acumen to streamline operations and expand the center's reach. As he spent more time there, he started forming connections with the people, learning their stories, and understanding their needs. The experience was humbling and eye-opening, showing him that wealth wasn't just about money. It was about the ability to effect positive change, to uplift others, and to build something lasting. Through his involvement, James slowly began to earn the trust and respect of those around him. He no longer saw himself as an outsider looking in, but as a part of something bigger. The isolation that had once defined his life began to dissolve, replaced by the warmth of community and the satisfaction of meaningful work. For the first time, James felt like he was truly living, contributing to a world that was richer and more rewarding than anything his previous life had offered. James stepped into the community center each day with a sense of purpose that had previously been foreign to him. The bustling energy of the place was a far cry from the sterile quiet of his office. Here the air was filled with the sound of children's laughter, the hum of conversation, and the occasional clatter of dishes being washed in the small kitchen. The walls, adorned with colorful artwork and bulletin boards plastered with announcements, gave the space a warmth and vitality that James had never experienced in his own world of boardrooms and high-stakes deals. The people he encountered were nothing like the polished, business-savvy individuals he was used to. They were hardworking, resilient, and often struggling just to make ends meet. Many were single parents, juggling multiple jobs, or elderly residents living on fixed incomes. They faced challenges that James had never considered, like how to stretch a paycheck to cover rent, food, and school supplies, or how to keep a child engaged in school despite the pressures of a difficult home life. These were problems that couldn't be solved with a quick financial fix, and James soon realized that true success here was measured in small, everyday victories. He found himself deeply moved by the stories he heard, like that of Mrs. Ramirez, an elderly woman who had recently lost her husband. Despite her grief, she came to the center every day to volunteer, finding solace in helping others. Or like that of Jordan, a bright teenager who had nearly dropped out of school to help support his family, but was now thriving, thanks to the tutoring and encouragement he received at the center. These were not the stories of massive triumphs, but of quiet perseverance, and James began to see the value in these small yet profound accomplishments. As James spent more time at the center, he began to form genuine relationships with the people there. At first, some were wary of him, unsure of his intentions. But as he listened to their concerns and offered practical solutions, whether it was helping someone draft a resume or arranging for additional food donations, he slowly earned their trust. He started to feel a connection to these people, a sense of belonging that had been absent from his life for as long as he could remember. They welcomed him into their world, not as the wealthy businessman who once looked down on them, but as someone who cared, who was willing to roll up his sleeves and work alongside them. Maria watched these changes in James with quiet curiosity. She saw how he interacted with others, how he was no longer the aloof man who had dismissed her that first day. Instead, he had become a part of the community, someone who was present, engaged, and, most importantly, humble. There was a subtle shift in their dynamic as well. While they never directly discussed that initial, fateful meeting, the tension that had once existed between them had dissipated. In its place was a mutual respect, born out of shared experiences and a growing understanding of one another. One afternoon, as James was helping to organize a community event, Maria approached him. "You've changed," she said softly, her eyes searching his for something unspoken. There was no accusation in her tone, just a simple observation that held a world of meaning. James paused, looking at her with a mixture of gratitude and reflection. "I think I'm finally starting to see what really matters," he replied, his voice tinged with the weight of everything he had learned. There was a sincerity in his words that Maria couldn't ignore, a recognition that he was no longer the man who had turned her away in her time of need. They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. It was as if the understanding they had developed was too delicate to be fully expressed in words. Maria nodded, a faint smile touching her lips, and James felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of peace he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. It wasn't just about helping others anymore. It was about being a part of something larger than himself, something meaningful. From that day on, their relationship evolved into a quiet camaraderie. They worked together on various projects, each bringing their strengths to the table. Maria's deep understanding of the community and its needs complemented James's organizational skills and resources. The trust between them grew, solidifying a partnership based not on past debts or obligations, but on a shared vision for the future. James was no longer an outsider trying to atone for his mistakes. He was, for the first time, part of a community that valued him not for his money, but for his heart. The transformation James had sparked within the community was nothing short of remarkable. What began as a personal journey of redemption had grown into a movement that touched the lives of many. Other wealthy individuals, once disconnected from the realities of the neighborhood, began to take notice of James's involvement. Curious and perhaps inspired by his change of heart, they started contributing in their own ways, some with financial donations, others by offering their time and expertise. It was as if a barrier had been broken, and with it, a flood of goodwill poured into the community. The community center, once a modest hub struggling to keep its doors open, became a beacon of hope. With the new resources, Mrs. Wallace and her team were able to expand their programs significantly. They launched job training courses that equip people with the skills needed to secure stable employment. After-school tutoring sessions grew in size, offering personalized attention that helped students not just keep up, but excel. The addition of small business grants gave aspiring entrepreneurs the means to turn their ideas into realities, fostering a sense of independence and pride among the residents. The impact was palpable. Families who had once teetered on the edge of financial ruin began to stabilize. The neighborhood, which had been marked by struggle and scarcity, started to flourish. Children who had been at risk of falling behind in school were now thriving, their futures brighter with each passing day. The streets, once quiet and forlorn, now buzzed with a new energy, one of hope, possibility, and a collective belief in a better tomorrow. It was a transformation that went beyond bricks and mortar. It was about rebuilding the spirit of the community. Maria, ever humble, continued her work with a renewed sense of purpose. She was still the same strong, determined woman who had refused James's money, but now she had an entire community behind her. The challenges she faced, raising her children alone, navigating the complexities of life without her husband, were still there, but they no longer felt insurmountable. The support she received from her neighbors, and even from those who had once been strangers, lightened her burden. She found comfort in the knowledge that her efforts were making a tangible difference, not just for her own family, but for everyone around her. The memory of John, her late husband, remained close to her heart. There were days when the grief would resurface, a reminder of the life they had planned together that was now gone. But Maria found strength in honoring his legacy through her work. She was determined to raise their children with the values John had lived by: resilience, kindness, and a deep sense of community. And as she looked around at the positive changes taking root, she knew she was on the right path. John's memory was alive in every success story that emerged from the community center, in every life that was touched by the programs she helped to nurture. James, too, found himself transformed in ways he hadn't anticipated. The satisfaction he once derived from his business successes paled in comparison to the fulfillment he now felt. It was a quiet, steady joy that came from knowing he was making a real difference. The milestones he celebrated were no longer tied to profits or deals, but to the progress he saw in the community. The new jobs, the thriving children, the businesses that were taking off. It was a kind of success that couldn't be measured in dollars, but in lives changed for the better. He began to see his role in the community not just as a benefactor, but as a partner in its ongoing journey. James continued to invest both his time and resources, always mindful of the lessons he had learned from Maria and the others. He no longer sought recognition for his contributions. The real reward was in the relationships he had built, the trust he had earned, and the knowledge that he was a part of something far greater than himself. The community had given him a sense of belonging he hadn't even known he was missing, and for that, he was profoundly grateful. As the neighborhood continued to grow and thrive, James found himself reflecting on how far they had all come. The once isolated businessman, who had valued wealth above all else, had found a new purpose in life. It was no longer about accumulating more, but about giving back, about being part of a community that cared for one another. And in that, James had found a happiness and fulfillment that no amount of money could ever buy. James had been so deeply immersed in his work at the community center that he hadn't noticed the subtle shifts within his company. The office that once felt like a second home had become an afterthought, a place he visited out of obligation rather than passion. It was during one of these routine visits, as he was skimming through reports, that he overheard a conversation that stopped him in his tracks. Two executives were speaking in hushed tones just outside his office, their words laced with concern and doubt. "He's lost his edge," one of them murmured, shaking his head. "Ever since he started spending all that time at the community center, the numbers have been slipping. The board's worried. They think it's time for a change." James felt a chill run down his spine. He closed the report in his hands, his mind racing. Was this what his colleagues really thought of him now? That he was too soft, too distracted by his philanthropic endeavors to effectively run the company he had built from the ground up? The words stung, not because they were entirely unfounded, but because they forced him to confront a truth he had been avoiding. He had changed. And with that change came a shift in his priorities, one that clearly didn't align with the expectations of his business associates. That evening, James sat alone in his office long after everyone else had left. The city lights twinkled outside the windows, but he found no comfort in them. His thoughts were a tangled mess of anger, betrayal, and confusion. How could the people he had trusted, the people who had stood by him during the rise of his empire, now be plotting against him? The idea of losing control over the company was unbearable at first, and his initial reaction was to fight back, to assert his authority, and prove that he was still the man they had always known. But as the hours ticked by, the anger began to subside, replaced by a deeper, more introspective feeling. James leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling, and began to reflect on the journey that had brought him to this point. The man he used to be would have done whatever it took to stay on top, cutting deals, leveraging alliances, manipulating situations to his advantage. That man would never have considered walking away from the power and influence he had amassed. But now, James felt different. The life he had built outside of the office, the one filled with genuine connections and meaningful work, had begun to matter more to him than the endless pursuit of profits and dominance. In that moment of clarity, James asked himself a question he had been avoiding for weeks. What did he truly want? The answer wasn't immediate, but it began to take shape as he thought about the community center, about Maria and the people who had welcomed him into their lives. The satisfaction he felt from helping others, from being part of something real and impactful, was something his company could never provide. The business, once the center of his universe, now felt like a relic of a life he was ready to leave behind. The more he considered it, the more the idea of stepping down began to appeal to him. It wasn't about giving up or admitting defeat. It was about choosing a path that aligned with the person he had become. James realized that the power and success he had once craved had lost their allure. What he craved now was purpose, and he had found that purpose not in the boardroom, but in the humble walls of the community center, surrounded by people who valued him not for his wealth, but for his willingness to give and to care. The next morning, James made his decision. He would meet with the board, but not to fight for his position. Instead, he would offer them a graceful exit, a transition plan that would allow him to step down as CEO while ensuring the company's continued success. He would retain a stake in the business, but his role would shift, allowing him the freedom to dedicate his time and resources to the community he had come to love. It was a decision that felt right, one that brought a sense of peace and resolve that James hadn't felt in years. As he prepared for the meeting, James felt a mixture of emotions, sadness for what he was leaving behind, but also excitement for the future he was embracing. The man who walked into the boardroom that day was no longer driven by fear or the need to prove himself. Instead, he was guided by a new understanding of what truly mattered in life. And as he sat down to face the men who once saw him as invincible, James knew that he was finally on the path he was meant to follow. James stood at the head of the long, polished conference table, the familiar view of the city skyline stretching out behind him. The boardroom, once a place where he commanded respect and fear in equal measure, now felt like a stage for an entirely different kind of performance. As the board members filed in, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern, James could sense the tension in the room. They had all heard the rumors, but no one knew exactly what to expect from this emergency meeting. Some still clung to the hope that James was here to reaffirm his commitment to the company, to squash any doubts about his leadership. As soon as everyone was seated, James cleared his throat and began speaking, his voice steady but lacking the sharp edge it once held. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he started, meeting the eyes of each person around the table. "I've called this meeting because there are some things I need to address, things that can't wait." He paused, letting his words sink in, then continued. "Over the past few months, I've gone through a significant personal transformation. My priorities have shifted, and with that shift, I've come to realize that my heart is no longer in this business the way it once was." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room, but James pressed on. "I've spent my entire life chasing success, building this company into what it is today. And while I'm proud of what we've achieved, I've come to understand that there's more to life than the pursuit of wealth and power. I've found a new purpose in giving back to the community, in helping others in a way that goes beyond the bottom line. That's where my passion lies now." He could see the shock on their faces, the disbelief that James Carter, the man who had always been laser-focused on business, was saying these words. "That's why I've made the decision to step down as CEO," James announced, the finality of his statement hanging in the air. "I know this may come as a shock, but it's the right thing to do. I've already identified a successor, someone who shares the same vision for the company's future, who has the skills and the drive to keep us moving forward while allowing me to step back." The room fell into stunned silence. James let the moment linger before introducing his chosen successor, a trusted colleague who had been with the company for years. "I've chosen Mark Hastings to take over as CEO," James said, gesturing towards Mark, who nodded in acknowledgement. "He has the experience, the knowledge, and most importantly, the dedication to lead this company into its next chapter. I have full confidence in his ability to guide you all." As the board absorbed the news, James could see a mix of reactions. Some members seemed relieved, perhaps even supportive of his decision, understanding the need for a leader fully committed to the company's future. Others looked unsettled, uneasy with the idea of losing the man who had been the driving force behind the company's success. But none of them could argue with James's decision. His reasoning was sound, and the logic behind it was clear, even if it was unexpected. In the days and weeks that followed, the transition began. James gradually handed over his responsibilities to Mark, ensuring a smooth handover. It was a strange experience for him, watching as the control he had once wielded so tightly slipped from his grasp. But instead of panic or regret, James felt a growing sense of peace. He was making room for something new in his life, something that mattered more to him now than any business deal ever could. On the last day, as James walked through the familiar halls of his company for the final time, he felt a mixture of nostalgia and relief. The office that had been the center of his world was now just a place where he had spent countless hours, but one that no longer defined him. As he stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, he looked up at the towering building that bore his name. There was no sadness in his heart, only a profound sense of liberation. For the first time, James was choosing a path, not because it was expected of him, but because it was the one he truly wanted to walk. The world of business had been good to him, had given him power and success, but it was time for something more. He had found a new calling, a new purpose, and as he left the office behind, James felt a deep, unshakable certainty that he was heading in the right direction. With his time and energy fully devoted to the community, James embraced his new role with an enthusiasm that surprised even himself. He was no longer the detached businessman who once valued profit above all else. He had become deeply invested in the lives and well-being of the people around him. Each day, he worked alongside Maria and the dedicated staff at the community center, brainstorming ways to expand their outreach and refine their services. The center, once a modest facility struggling to make ends meet, was now a thriving hub of activity. The programs they offered, job training, educational support, health services, touched lives far beyond the neighborhood's borders. The center's transformation didn't happen overnight. It took countless hours of planning, networking, and sheer determination. James's connections in the business world proved invaluable as he secured funding from new donors and forged partnerships with other organizations. Yet, it wasn't just the financial contributions that made the difference. It was the way the community had rallied together, driven by a shared vision of a better future. Under James's leadership, the center expanded its influence, becoming a model for similar initiatives across the region. The once small and overlooked neighborhood became a place of inspiration, where stories of resilience and recovery were now the norm. National recognition soon followed. News outlets began to feature the remarkable turnaround of the community center, highlighting the innovative programs and the positive impact they had on the lives of thousands of families. James found himself in the spotlight, his name now associated not with corporate success, but with meaningful change. Invitations to speak at conferences and events poured in, but James remained grounded. Whenever he was asked about the success of the center, he redirected the praise to the community itself, the people who had fought for their future, and proved that even in the face of adversity, they could rise above it together. Maria watched these developments with a deep sense of fulfillment. She had seen firsthand the transformation not just in James, but in the entire community. The man who had once refused to help her in her darkest hour had become a pillar of strength and support, not just for her, but for everyone who walked through the doors of the center. Her husband's legacy lived on in the work they did, and in the lives they touched. Knowing that John's sacrifice had inspired such positive change brought her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new wing of the community center was a momentous occasion. The sun shone brightly that day, casting a warm glow over the gathering crowd. The air buzzed with excitement as people from all walks of life came together to celebrate. James stood at the front, holding the oversized scissors with Maria by his side. The new wing, named in honor of John Jenkins, was a testament to the power of community and the enduring impact of one man's bravery. As the ribbon fell, cheers erupted from the crowd, and James felt a swell of emotion that brought tears to his eyes. As the ceremony continued, James found a quiet moment to reflect on the journey that had brought him here. The path had been unexpected, filled with challenges and difficult choices, but it had led him to a place where he finally felt at home. He realized that true wealth wasn't about the numbers in a bank account or the accolades he had once chased. It was about the lives he had been able to touch, the positive changes he had helped to bring about, and the legacy he was now a part of, a legacy that was much bigger than himself. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, Maria turned to James with a smile. "John would be proud of what you've done here," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude and warmth. James looked at her, feeling a deep sense of connection and understanding. "I couldn't have done it without you, Maria," he replied. "You and this community showed me what really matters in life. I'm just grateful I got the chance to be a part of it." As they stood together, watching the children play in the courtyard of the new wing, James felt a profound sense of contentment. The road ahead was still filled with challenges, but he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The community center was more than just a building. It was a symbol of hope, resilience, and the power of coming together for a greater good. And in that moment, James realized that this, more than any business deal or financial success, was his true legacy. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Now, how about another one? To watch another nice story, just click on the video appearing on your screen.